preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Nadell McGee. I am the director of the Charles Simon Center for Adult Life and Learning here at the 92nd Street Y. Welcome to our Books and Breakfast series, where we feature extraordinary people discussing contemporary life, values, and ideas. The 92nd Street Y wishes to thank our sponsor, Barnes & Noble, for its continued support of this wonderful series. Upcoming breakfast guests in the next couple of months include David Halberstam, Helen Thomas, George Stephanopoulos, and Cokie Roberts. We hope that you will join us for the next group of breakfast guests. This morning's guest is Pete Hamill, who I know you all know and love. And he will be discussing his book, Why Sinatra Matters, with Leonard Lopate, who is the host of the WNYC talk show, New York and Company. So before we spend any more time on me, let's get our guests out here. Please join me in welcoming Pete Hamill and Leonard Lopate. Thank you. Cards on the tables in front of you. Those are for your questions, and there will be ushers walking around during the course of the program to pick the cards up from you. Thanks.
Great. This past November, Hofstra University put together a 3-day conference called Frank Sinatra, the Man, the Music, the Legend. 1,200 people attended. There were 43 panels and 120 scholarly papers presented. Obviously, some people consider the man who was known affectionately as Old Blue Eyes and the Voice as something more than just a fine crooner. Then again, he was also called the chairman of the board. In the 1970s, Pete Hamill was involved for a time in a plan to produce a Sinatra autobiography, and although that never happened, now, over 25 years later, Mr. Hamill has written a little book for Little Brown called Why Sinatra Matters. And I'm always happy to talk to you, Pete. We went to school together, so we go back a long way, although he doesn't remember me, I remember him.
I don't want to remember.
Well, you were an upperclassman, I was a freshman. How far did the autobiographical project go with Sinatra?
Well, I met with him over a period, about the book, over a period of about, 3 months, sporadically, because part of the thing was trying to convince Sinatra that if he was going to do this book, that there were certain areas that he had to talk about. He had to talk about his politics, which had shifted from the New Deal to sort of Reagan Republicanism, the women in his life, and the mob. And he said, well, the first thing, I can talk about politics until dawn, he said, and the women, I love them all, he said. He said, but if I talk about some of those other guys, someone might come knocking at my door. Mm-hmm. Then he corrected himself a few days later and said, oh, what the hell, let's talk about them too, because most of them are dead, which they were at that point. The book did not happen because of me, not of Sinatra, and I regret it to an extent. What had happened was Agnew got driven out of office, basically, took a nolo contendere plea in the state of Maryland with a lot greater success than Mike Tyson did last Friday. And went off to play golf in Palm Springs for the rest of his life, and Sinatra threw him a big party. And it was still the lingering period of the vehemence of the 1960s, and particularly about Nixon. Watergate had begun to flow, and I thought, God, there's some things I'll never be able to explain to my kids, and this book might be one of them. Mm-hmm. So I backed out of it. And I regret it because the things that might have been solved about some of the mysteries of this fellow never were. He never made a deal with anybody else to try to tell his story from his point of view. I had tried to set up a form for it too, because I hate those as told to books. They're awful. It's the only one I ever in my life had considered doing. And I thought I could do a book where he would talk and then I would go get the principals and let them talk and make it like Rashomon, you know, which would have saved, you know, something of my honor if I had done it that way. And I never got to do that. Dizzy Gillespie did a book like that, and it's very good and very well done. But I'm sorry that I didn't do it. It was a little, partly because of my youth and my arrogance that I didn't follow it through.
Well, also, I'm sure you're a lot more tolerant of people's political opinions today than you might have been at the time.
Right. I mean, it's hard for people who weren't around in that time to understand the true passion that was attached to it. And that passion was driven to a large extent by the fact that people were coming home dead every week in body bags. It wasn't like an abstract discussion of morality. It was connected to something much more vivid and meaningful for millions of people whose kids were out there. But I think also there was a great disillusioning shift in all politics that began around that period.
But you were a huge fan then, I suspect.
I was a fan of the music. It wasn't the only music. I didn't ride around playing Frank Sinatra in the car or wear a
When girls came
Walkman
over for dates, put on Only the Lonely.
Yeah, but it was. I thought it was superb music when I first heard it. And it was music as a young man growing up in Brooklyn that sounded like what we wanted to sound like. It didn't mean we did, but it had an urban quality to it that was so much different from almost anything else that was going on at the time. And then I got to know him in 1963 and liked him.
How did you get to meet him? Was Shirley MacLaine a link?
No, I was covering.
I didn't mean that in a bad way.
No, she later on she was, but not.
I said a link.
I
I didn't say anything salacious or whatever the Monica Lewinsky word is of the moment.
That's my life. That's not salacious. I had gone to for the New York Post. I was a reporter there, and they sent me out to cover the Patterson-Liston fight in Las Vegas. And at the fight,
Sonny Liston brought you together.
Sonny Liston brought us together. Actually, it was Jimmy Cannon, the sports columnist, once of the Post and then of the Journal-American. And the fight was over in about 43 seconds. We all wrote very quickly, and Cannon said, "Come on, let's go someplace." Cannon was a wonderful sort of downtown New Yorker type. And off he took me to the Sands Hotel, where I sat down at a table with Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Joey Bishop, and the baseball manager, Leo DeRocher. And the star of the table was DeRocher. DeRocher had the most wonderful gift for obscenity and that I had ever heard at the time. It was the Baroque version. You know, he was sort of like Bellini with four-letter words. And so I had the good sense, I don't know how I found it, to just shut up and listen. I was 28 years old or something, and I just sat and listened to these guys and got to know Sinatra a little bit through there. And then through Cannon, we met again in New York. And then after that, Sinatra had a kind of rhythm that when he came to New York, he would call up certain people, and the rhythm was absolutely the opposite of California. Most of the people he liked in New York were newspaper men. Most of the people he got in trouble with in California were newspaper men.
Like punching Lee Mortimer.
Yeah, like punching Lee Mortimer is a classic example. And Robert Ruark gave him trouble, although he was not a West Coast guy, but he fed off that sort of Sinatra versus the press problem. So that I would get calls from him from time to time. "Hey, I'm in town, what are you doing? Come on over." And we could go to a place like Clark's, sort of Patsy's or Jilly's and these places. And it was more like a verbal jam session than anything else. It was not. It was men hanging out mainly. There were very few women around.
In fact, that was a style that was interesting to me because that's never been my style. But Al Jolson did the same sort of thing, and Sinatra. Debbie Reynolds complained that she married Eddie Fisher, and the next thing she knew, she was in some place in Hollywood, and he was in New York with the guys. I wonder what that was all about. You know, when Ava Gardner heard that he was marrying Mia Farrow, she said about the meanest thing anybody could ever say. She said, "I knew he'd marry a woman who looked like a boy."
Well, when Jimmy Breslin got married to his second wife, Ronnie Eldridge, wonderful woman, I tried to persuade her to keep the relationship straight in its essence from the beginning and adopt him.
Well, your title here, Why Sinatra Matters, suggests that you're about something a lot more than this guy we've been talking about so far, making jokes about. In your introduction, you write, he helped change the way all of us lived. Frank Sinatra helped push the country forward. That's a lot more than talking about how a talented pop singer may have been the best in your estimation.
I mean, I think Sinatra had a role to play in the society beyond being one of its entertainers. And he did it through his work, through his art, basically, through the music. And I think what he'll be remembered for is the music, essentially. This little book has one sentence about the Rat Pack, I think. And what I think he did was to take the values of the immigrant generation, he's the child of immigrants, and the values that came into American cities during Prohibition and then the Depression, and make them into something. He changed, among many other things, he was one of the most important guys in changing the stereotypical view of Italian Americans or Italian immigrants. He had some help from Joe DiMaggio and Fiorello LaGuardia, but after Sinatra began to sing, when people heard that diction and so on, that was the end of shows like Life with Luigi, for example, which was the Italian-American version of Amos and Andy, or The Stage Irishman, or Step and Fetch It. You know, he immediately, by the style in which he did his work, began to shift all that around. There had been exotic Italians, of Rudolph Valentino being, I guess, the greatest example of it. But nobody like the kind of person who had this success. And he could not have had it without technology. And by that I mean, Sinatra was born 1915. It was the same year that RCA Victor went into mass production of phonographs, the kind of wind-up things that lasted for a long, long time. The same year, two other singers were born, Edith Piaf and Billie Holiday. All three could not have been the kinds of stars they became without the technology of both the phonograph record and the microphone. They allowed someone other than an opera singer to be able to entertain large numbers of people. And I think that was very important, that he would take it and not do a version of O Solo Mio as his basic act. It was very American when he began it. His roots are in Tin Pan Alley, not in Sicily, in terms of his musical roots. So he didn't sing a real sort of bel canto kind of song. But I think what he did do is to create a sound that was not there before. Before Sinatra, the major star of the music business and movies too was Bing Crosby. But Crosby was a kind of area code 800 singer. You didn't know where he was from. You know, you had no idea. He was from the studio, you know.
Well, he came out of jazz, actually.
Yeah, he
Paul
did
Whiteman.
with Paul Whiteman, but he was not really a jazz singer, nor was Sinatra for that matter.
But Al Jolson was also a huge star, and he was doing some kind of a white version of black music.
Yeah, but it still wasn't the music that Sinatra brought, which was. Jolson was a huge star, but not that huge a star as a record seller. Mm-hmm. Not the star that the 15-year-old girls would swoon about. He was the greatest star for Oni Madden and a lot of gangsters and stuff like that. But he was not. He was a star, certainly, but not to any degree the way Sinatra was, because Sinatra benefited from the phonograph record in a way, and from one other big thing that was very important, which was radio. Because radio made it then possible for somebody who was regional, like Sinatra, northeastern, to become a national star. That had never happened before.
The conference at Hofstra revealed that Frank Sinatra means very different things to people, and one of the groups consisted of Italian-American men who all delivered papers about how he helped define Italian-American identity. Now, as an Irish-American growing up in Brooklyn, did you see any connections? Did you see Sinatra as somebody who was doing the same sort of thing you wish some Irish singer other than Dennis Day and Bobby Breen might be doing?
How do you remember Dennis Day? I can sing part of Clancy Lowered the Boom, which was... no, I didn't see... There certainly were, in Brooklyn growing up, some ethnic identifications going on. There were some Irishmen who were Crosby people, because the great struggle became Crosby or Sinatra.
Mm-hmm. Irish versus Italian.
But yeah, and it was essentially that feud. But where I grew up, it was more generational. It was, Sinatra was the great star for the younger people, and Crosby was the star for older people. That was what it was in our household, and what it was basically around the immediate neighborhood. So I think what people were connecting to with Sinatra was his urban sound. It was a sound much different from the sound of Crosby and the sound of almost anybody else at the time. Later there were a lot of imitators, but it was an urban sound. It came from cities. It didn't come from, it wasn't like Hank Williams singing from the South. It wasn't novelty singing, most of it. But there were other differences too. He's one of the few entertainers who started off with primarily a female audience and ended up with primarily a male audience. And that itself, that's why it was kind of odd in our neighborhood that a lot of the young guys connected to Sinatra.
And what do you think that is? It happened with Elvis as well, but I wonder why. Because Sinatra really was a Bobby Soxer. He had that Bobby Soxer appeal, and guys, the boyfriends of those girls are always furious with the singer who gets that kind of attention.
Well, I think initially it was because Sinatra was a wartime phenomenon. 4.5 million men were in the armed forces when he walked on the stage in the Paramount for the first time. So he became a singer who created some image for those young women that was not the same for the men. In fact, a lot of the men resented him.
He didn't go to the
war.
Army.
He was 4F, and so he didn't go to the war. And not only that, he didn't go and do what a lot of other people did, which is at least tour with the USO in North Africa. So he didn't go on a USO tour until the week after the war in Europe ended, in May. So there was some resentment that went on at the time. And in places like the neighborhood where I grew up, you believed that if a guy didn't go to the army, the fix was in. You know, there was some sense he went to some wood healer and laid money on him and got out of the draft, so, which was not true, by the way, in Sinatra's case. So when those guys came back, the women generally married all those guys. And there's nothing more embarrassing to a 22-year-old with 2 children than the passions that she had when the summer she was 15. Nothing's more embarrassing. So a lot of the women began to back away or lose interest in him, and that's when he had the great crisis in 1951-52, after he went off with Ava Gardner and infuriated the women and didn't get the men until he fell completely apart. And then the men said, hey, this guy knows something.
I wonder what would have happened if he had followed Harry James's advice and changed his name to Frankie Satin. You think he would have become the superstar he became?
Absolutely. Neither did he. You know, he said to me when he was telling this tale, this happened like 1938, 39. Harry James was looking for his new band, his own orchestra. A singer, a male singer, heard Sinatra on a radio broadcast, went over to the Rustic Cabin in New Jersey to get him, and he said, the only thing is you're going to have to change that name. You got to, and he says, to what? He said, Frankie Satin. And Sinatra, telling me this story, said, can you imagine Frankie Satin? I'd be playing cruise ships today.
Well, it's interesting to look at the list of Italian-American singers who followed. Half kept their names, but, you know, you have Perry Como, Dean Martin, Jerry Roselli, Jerry Vale, Tony Bennett, Vic Damone. It's about a 50-50 split, but nothing like Satin, which sounds kind of sleazy.
Well, I think it's hard to imagine. I just finished writing a piece about a writer I like a lot named Evan Hunter,
Ed McBain,
who writes the Ed McBain 87th Precinct novels, which I think are very high order and valuable series of novels over the last 45 years. His real name is Salvador Lombino. He was born in East Harlem and grew up on 120th Street and Pleasant Avenue. And he changed his name at around the same time this was going on. He changed his name in 1950. And the reason was, some editors said, you can't write these stories and call yourself Sal Lombino. At the time, there was no Mario Puzo, there was no Francis Coppola,
Don DeLillo.
There were none of the great changes that yet happened. And so he ended up being called a version of Frankie Satin because he was convinced by those in authority that that's the way he could succeed in America, by being less than himself.
And then he wrote Blackboard Jungle, and he was stuck with the name forever.
Yeah, the Blackboard Jungle was the first novel under the... well, he actually had done a couple of children's books under Evan Hunter and went to Hunter College. But he was stuck with the book once Blackboard Jungle became a success. It became a big, huge success. So I think that's relevant to the era in which Sinatra was functioning, that there was still a lot of... There were Jews changing their names for the same reasons, obviously. They used to tell a joke around Stillman's gym. The phone would ring and someone would pick it up and he'd say, Kelly? Kelly? He says, you want the Jewish Kelly or the Italian Kelly? You know?
Well, there are stories that Frank Sinatra's father, Martin, was a fighter who fought under an Irish name, but you say there's no proof of it. It's just part of the myth, perhaps.
So far, it's just family legend. I couldn't find... from the New Jersey Athletic. I wasn't doing the kind of biography that would require that.
Didn't Will Friedland look into that? He looked at
he
everything
did, and
else.
he couldn't find much either. He didn't make much out of it. But Sinatra's father, according to family legend, boxed and called himself Slacksy O'Brien. Not Slacksy O'Brien, Marty O'Brien, and Sinatra was known as Slacksy O'Brien for a while because he was the only guy in the neighborhood with more than 2 pairs of slacks. I think that was one reason.
Yeah.
I mean, the name of the bar that they ran was Marty O'Brien's.
Well, he was an only child. Is that why he had... I mean, that's odd in an Italian Catholic family to be an only child. How important do you think that was?
I think it was crucial in a certain way because one of the things that Sinatra became, particularly in the ballads, was someone who understood loneliness in a way that nobody else quite had before. The sense Crosby brought to being alone was a kind of nonchalance that was wonderful and admirable, but you really felt the anxiety of it in Sinatra, and he brought to it a kind of stoic quality. So it wasn't simply, oh, woe is me, I will never live without you. It was, I will live without you. You know, don't worry about me, I'll get along, was what he's saying. And I think that came from growing up as an only child in a neighborhood of large families.
You also say that he brings a kind of an old world weariness that probably comes from his immigrant background, but also an optimism that many immigrants had, that they would come to the United States, they gambled everything, came here, and assumed that they would become rich or at least more successful than they were back home. So we have this mix of kind of tiredness and optimism at the same time.
Yes, I think
contradictory, isn't it?
But I think it was not unique to Sinatra. I think it was true of the whole Italian immigration wave, because one of the things we always have to try to understand about that was the era in which the Italians arrived. They arrived in a period where in 1891 in New Orleans, the greatest lynching in American history, still the record holder, took place. 11 Italians lynched, more than the greatest lynching in American history, where there was such brutal anti-Italian sentiment in a lot of places that the Italians became the immigrant group from which more people went home than any other. The Irish would go back to Ireland once they got the pension check from the telephone company or something. The Jews never went back. And
to Russia sometime.
About 2 million of the 4.5 million Italians went home, which is why when World War II started and the first soldiers arrived in Sicily, Naples, and places, there were so many people who spoke a little bit of English that were able to help the Americans. But I think we forget the kind of the bigotry and prejudice of the period that afflicted Italians, which makes the triumph of people like Sinatra even more remarkable, in my opinion.
But it's interesting that at that conference at Hofstra, the papers that got the most negative response were the ones that suggested that Sinatra really rose to where he was because of white privilege. They said that, you know, there were other great singers, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, who achieved prominent places in the hierarchy of American popular song. But if you look at the ones who really have reached the top, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, they're all white. And to some degree, they all borrow from their black predecessors. Not necessarily better. I mean, Frank Sinatra, how does he compare to Duke Ellington or Charlie Parker or Miles Davis? When that kind of argument was made, people stood up and, thank God this crowd is a nicer crowd, they started screaming at the person who would even suggest something like that.
Well, I think it's like this saying, it's saying the Yankees of 1927 derived all their skills from the Red Sox of 1914. You know, it's like comparing one. It's not the notion that somehow black music, African American music at least, rose like Botticelli's Venus with no roots of its own anywhere else is absurd. No scholar of American music and black music is American music would ever claim that. It comes from a whole variety of things: Scotch-Irish tunes, Western harmonics. If you listen to African American music and listen to music from Cuba, where plantations were larger and more isolated, the rhythm sections, the rhythm structures are even different. So there's no African American claim to have been the only original thing in American music that's of any validity.
But an argument can be made that Louis Armstrong is the greatest singer and perhaps the greatest.
Oh, thank you.
I didn't know your mother was here.
79314. almost got away with it.
But Louis Armstrong, you know,
a claim
he's a
could be
giant,
made
giant.
that Louis Armstrong was the greatest singer, but it couldn't be sustained. You know, he's certainly one of the most crucial American musicians, one of the great trumpet players. People are still eating off his plate. But as a singer, his range was very limited. He did show a certain way to approach a song, but I don't think he had any influence on Sinatra, nor I think did Billie Holiday, which is much more often claimed. Mm-hmm. I think what he got from Billie Holiday was a way to inhabit the song, the way an actor inhabits a role, you know, that you would go in. It's not your words, but the words are written by somebody else. But you can find some way into that piece to get an emotion that means something to you. That's what I think he got from Billie Holiday. Louis Armstrong wrote very few songs, as did Sinatra wrote a few, Billie Holiday wrote a few, but essentially they were interpreters of other people's music. And I think any claim that no Louis Armstrong, no Frank Sinatra is cockeyed. I think nobody's listening carefully to it.
You talked about him almost acting a song. Now, we only really become aware of him as a fine actor later. Even though he's in an awful lot of Hollywood movies, he was perfectly fine, he was very natural. But do you think that there was always that acting ability there? When you listen to the early records, do you hear some of the stuff that you hear later, or is that something that developed over the years?
Yeah, that develops, because I think, like almost any artist or writer or painter, your skill is sometimes ahead of your heart. I remember your ability, rather, to put them together. I remember being at a dinner party once and sitting with, of all people, Margot Fonteyn, and asking her what had she learned from the long years, starting when she's a baby, essentially, as a dancer. She said the saddest thing about it was that when she finally understood what the music was about, her body wouldn't execute it. Which, because dancers are much more like athletes, is probably typical of a lot of dancers. And I think in the case of someone like Sinatra, that he didn't live enough to be able to inhabit those early songs. There's a callowness to them, which is very appealing when you listen to them.
Because he has such a gorgeous voice.
Yeah, because the voice is there, and there's a kind of exuberance that in the up-tempo stuff that's really wonderful. But the ballads, he doesn't really get them right until he gets together with Nelson Riddle and does the Wee Small Hours album, and by then it's because someone stepped on his face. You know, he had some grief, he had fallen.
He'd also lost some of that glorious voice. It was
yes,
and that actually initially seems like a tragedy. Later, it seems like an added quality.
Yes.
It's still a very fine voice, but it is not that perfect voice he had when he was young, and it's about 2 octaves lower.
Yeah, and it's got some burr on it, and it has some knowledge in it, you know. And in the voice itself, you get a sense that the guy singing after 1953 or 4 is a man, and the one before that is a boy.
How much of the phrasing that he has been so praised for is there from the start? Is that also something that comes along with this added knowledge?
I think it has to. You know, in other words, he as he got to understand the emotions of the music that he was trying to express, I think it simultaneously began to understand what could be done with his voice in a way that expressed the emotion. And although hitting the high notes and the second balcony and all that was not what he was trying to do, I think the maturity of the man entered into the music in a way that made it sound very original.
One of the things that adds to his appeal later to certain rock singers is the rebel side, the guy who punches Lee Mortimer when he's red-baited by the columnists like him. He hangs out with the Rat Pack, a bunch of adult delinquents, and it's interesting that after that really, and the mob connections, whether they were there or not, they make him seem like kind of a semi-outlaw, and yet he comes to be known as the chairman of the board.
Well, if you read about the robber barons, there were a lot worse gangsters in the 19th century called chairman of the board than there were in the 20th.
Well, the New Republic wrote in the 50s, Sinatra's not nice. And they were saying that was part of his appeal.
Well, I think the public Sinatra, when you start to look at if you looked at all the clips in the books and so on, there's like 5 or 6 major incidents over a long period, over 50 years, 60 years. Not that many. But the time that I've spent around him, I knew there was a monster in there somewhere. I never saw it. That doesn't mean it didn't exist, but it does mean that it depends on the day. Maybe he was the Latrell Sprewell of his day. Sometimes you have a bad day and you punch out Lee Mortimer, who anybody in this room who ever met Lee Mortimer would probably have gladly done the same thing. But the rebellious part of it took other forms, and I think that rebellious thing is in there, and it was shaped by Prohibition and the Depression. When he went to Hollywood in 1943, remember the first Academy Award he won was for a short written by Albert Maltz, one of the Hollywood 10, called The House I Live In. It was a period when virtually nobody in Hollywood would take a public political stand of any kind. And here was Sinatra defending, letting it be known that he was sending money to the NAACP, defending Jews, attacking anti-Semitism.
Singing The House We Live In.
And the House We Live In. That was something new. So the rebelliousness was not simply, punching out Lee Mortimer, who deserved it. Just by any time he walked in a room, that's what you wanted to do, In my neighborhood, they'd hit him with a chair, But it took this other saying, I'm independent of this. I'm not going to play by the rules that have existed for the last 20 years in Hollywood. I'm going to do something else. And he paid a price for it.
I've been handed these questions, and usually I go through them and I say, oh, I don't want to do that one, I don't want to do that one. These are all great.
Good.
So I don't know if we're going to get to them all, but this
Let's
is
try.
A very smart crowd out here. We'll start with this is the first one that I got. While Sinatra may have broken some stereotypes, the Mafia stereotype continued with him. What was true, what wasn't, and why did he need to be involved with organized crime?
What was true was that he knew some of these guys from the earliest years of his career. I asked him about it, and he said, I worked in saloons. I didn't meet many Franciscan nuns working there, monks working there, or Nobel Prize winners. These were guys who came out of Prohibition, and when it became legal to work again, they ran saloons. So he knew a lot of them in there. The notion that they made his career possible is ridiculous.
You mean the horse's head from The Godfather?
It's
didn't
ridiculous.
happen?
It's a wonderful piece of fiction, by the way. But it's ridiculous because these guys, anybody who knows mob guys knows what they're like. They're some of the dumbest human beings you've ever met in your life. They stand around in leather car coats, scratching themselves, and saying, what do you want to do? I don't know, what do you want to do? They stand to each other. Their basic project in life is to make as much money as possible without working. If they could have invented Frank Sinatra, they'd have invented 1,000 Frank Sinatras. They'd have made money over and over again with Frank Sinatra. They didn't. Sinatra's attitude towards them was amusement. He thought some of them were funny. He was friends with a couple. He was friends with Momo Giancana, who was the boyfriend of Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire sisters. And but the notion that his career was made possible by it is ridiculous. I think at the beginning he was infuriated about the link, because part of it went back to the Prohibition days when his mother ran a speakeasy. That's who delivered booze to speakeasies, were gangsters or their agents. But later on, I think he just gave up trying to fight it. He was I once described him as the most investigated American performer since John Wilkes Booth. And I think that was true, and he was never indicted for anything.
In fact, the FBI files turned up nothing, the ones that were recently released.
The FBI files were ludicrous. They were more about the idiocy of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover and, the rest of them than they were about Frank Sinatra. But I think the mob stereotype, which replaced the older stereotype, did have its value, because it was a stereotype of power, not of powerlessness. And one of the things that Sinatra exuded on a stage, if those of you who have ever seen him perform live, was power. I don't mean the power to hurt or harm or put you on a meat hook or something, but a sense of owning and inhabiting that room. I mean, and it was about power. And I think that's the big difference in the stereotypes. The version of the stage Irishman that ended up as Life with Luigi and Please It Don't Squeeze It, the Fruit and all that, was a stereotype based on powerlessness.
Well, I want to follow up with a question here that talks about his stage persona. I was always disappointed in Sinatra's ad-libs between numbers during a live performance. How did you feel about this part of his routine?
I agree. I think there's one album which he performs with Count Basie at the Sands, and the singing is wonderful, and the routine, to me, is appalling. It's just stupid. He must have been drinking. I think he went on too long with that stuff. It was one of the problems. And he didn't need to do it. I liked it much better when he just sat down and did the singing.
He was a very good actor. Did he discuss his acting career with you?
We never got that far, but I think the acting is erratic because he didn't work hard enough at it, particularly in the later parts of his career. He just wanted to do everything in one take, show up and leave. Some of the early stuff, which I like some of the things before Man with the Golden Arm and From Here to Eternity. I think he's great in Anchors Aweigh, for example.
On the Town.
And On the Town. I mean, you see both of those and you say, this guy could have done anything. The dancing is good. Mm-hmm. Because he had Gene Kelly there to whip him over the head to make him do it. But maybe that's why he never tried to do it again. It was very heavy lifting to do that kind of work.
This one asks, who picked up the tab at Jilly's, Patsy's, and Clark's?
Not me. I was working for Dorothy Schiff.
She must have been horrified you even hang out with Frank
She didn't.
Sinatra. The Post was a very liberal paper then.
Yeah, well, he was still a liberal in those days.
Oh, right.
Basically, publicly.
Why was Sinatra 4F? Could Sinatra... this is one of those 23 question things. Why was Sinatra
punctured
4F?
eardrum, which was punctured during childbirth. When he was being born, they used forceps on him, and somehow, because he was a huge baby, he was like 13 pounds or something, and he gained about 10% more than that by the time he was... But the doctor apparently used forceps and punctured the eardrum, and that all seems pretty legitimate.
Was Kitty Kelly's biography accurate re his violence towards women and men who displeased him?
There's a lot of very good stuff in Kitty Kelly's book. Some very good reporting. And I think the book is marred by throwing everything into it. There's no judicial sorting out of what is true and relevant and what is just dish and gossip and unprovable. So I don't think, if you read it, you would think this man is in a constant state of rage, and it was just not true. I don't know that he ever beat up any women, but certainly he on occasion went too far. Part of it was there was a kind of gunfighter syndrome. I mean, like the movie The Gunfighter, where he'd be in a bar with some other guys and somebody would come over and say, you don't look so tough to me. You know, one of those kind of things.
Usually Ernest Borgnine.
So there was that, and then there was the impression of latent violence because he had these bodyguards around a lot. And the bodyguards were really to keep these nutcases away from him, but some people interpreted the bodyguards' function to keep Sinatra away from the people. And I don't think that was true at all.
Well, I once had the good fortune to interview Mia Farrow, and she said that when all of the stuff came out about Woody Allen and the kids, Frank called her, and he asked, maybe I should send some guys to break his legs. And she was very proud of that. She was not horrified by that. That meant that Frank still considered her to be under his protection.
But neither of us were there, none of us were there. But one thing I've learned after many years in the newspaper business is don't practice irony in an underdeveloped country. Sinatra might have been saying this with very self-conscious, ironical intentions to try to relieve stress in poor Mia, and maybe she didn't catch the note.
Oh no, she got that. She got that. It was funny. We have just a few moments left, and I really want to ask you about journalism for a moment. Your last book was about journalism. The Post continues to fire anyone with an IQ over 100. Dave Kerr, the fine film
The Daily
critic.
News, actually.
The Daily News. Oh, yeah, you were at the Daily News. That's right.
Both.
You started at the Post, but your last newspaper job was the Daily News.
Yes.
And all of the stuff that you instituted seems to be now in the process of either dismantling or totally gone.
I think that's true, and I think it's sad. You can't lose, as the Daily News has lost in the last year, 3 Pulitzer Prize winners, one to death, unfortunately, in the case of Mike McAlery, and add a gossip columnist and what I call handout digest on page 2, which tells you there's a poetry reading in Bensonhurst tonight at 9. You know, nobody makes arrangements that way. And you can't do that and lose those other kinds of people and make the paper better. And I think any of us who care about newspapers, and I care about all of them, I want the Times to be better and the Post to be better and the News to be better. I can be happy at the kind of dumbing down that is going on at the Daily News. I really feel bad about it.
What do you think cable is going to do, and most of the newspapers, after Friday? Is there a kind of a collective suicide when
what's Friday?
They can automatically...
Is this the Y2K thing or something? What's Friday?
The Senate's supposed to finally vote on this darn thing.
Oh, that. I think maybe he'll be overwhelmed by something far more important, the firing of Van Gundy from the Knicks.
They already got rid of Tim McCarver. I'm very upset.
Well, but it's a very good point because cable television has converted, particularly MSNBC, has converted itself into this hysterical, all italics all the time kind of news show. I mean, I was on one night with Chris Matthews from Hardball, and it was about this little book. And he said, well, what about Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe and Jack Kennedy and how they got together and they killed Marilyn Monroe and and there were so many overlapping conspiracy theories that I laughed out loud. There was nothing else you could do, and I think we're going to get that maybe for a long time, but that those shows are going to be seen as part of the time of this hysteria, and that they will vanish because people don't want to relive that kind of hysteria. They've so glommed onto this one story at the expense of all other stories that they look like any other obsessives. And people don't like to spend a lot of time with people obsessed, you know?
Well, Chris Matthews should change the name of his show to Oddball instead of Hardball. Pete Hamill will be signing books in the front. I want to thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Pete. Thank you to all the people at the Y. Thank you to Emily Hoffman.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.